This is For Keeps, a podcast about collections and connections. I'm David Peterkowski. This is a unique collector's story that features bucking horses, bucking stereotypes, and using your voice to set the historical record straight, even if your voice, quite literally, isn't what it used to be. And because it's a story that begins in the Old West, it's only fitting that it's set deep in the heart of Texas. The collector in this story is a man named Larry Callies. He's a black man and lifelong Texan who's led many lives as a ranch hand, a rodeo rider, a mailman, and a country music singer. But in 2017, after years of collecting historical items for his own enjoyment, he took a leap of faith and opened the Black Cowboy Museum in Rosenberg, Texas. The small museum, in a suburban strip mall about 30 miles southwest of Houston, features 3 rooms of artifacts educating visitors about the critical and often underreported role that African Americans played in the Old West and in more recent times, on ranches, in law enforcement, in rodeos, and more. For Larry, who's now in his late 60s, his collection helps to set the record straight. Popular culture, after all, has typically presented cowboys as white men, even though some historians say that roughly a quarter of cowboys in the era of westward expansion were actually black. Larry's collection, ranging from photography to badges, from saddles to rodeo memorabilia, aims to dispel the whitewashing of Western imagery. Helping to reframe that imagery, as part of a cultural movement of sorts, are black entertainers such as Lil Nas X and Beyoncé, who've remixed black cowboy culture through their music and style in what's been called the Yeehaw Agenda. As for Larry, as the Black Cowboy Museum's tour guide, he relishes the opportunity to be an entertainer in his own right, something he used to do as a singer. In the 1980s, Larry's skills and popularity in country music brought him to the brink of the big time. He even shared a manager with country superstar George Strait. But just as a major record label was ready to sign him to a contract, Larry lost his voice. He was diagnosed with vocal dysphonia, an incurable condition that causes involuntary spasms of the larynx muscles, making the voice have a tight, strained sound. Larry had no choice but to give up singing. Though he's still a showman at heart and eager to promote the museum that he's poured his life savings into, he still struggles a bit with the loss of his old voice. But these days, his collection of historical artifacts and the fascinating stories behind them come first. So, let's hop in the saddle and take a long, meandering trail ride of sorts, one that'll lead us to the prized collection at Larry's Black Cowboy Museum. Larry was born into a family of cowboys, and at a very young age, he looked up to his grandfather with a special admiration for his footwear.
He had a pair of boots that was really cool, and they had eagles on them. They were made by Don Quixote, a famous boot maker from Mexico, back in 1952. And I have these boots in my museum, and I talk about them. But when I was 3 years old, I used to see my grandpa wear them. When he come in the door, all I said to my mom, I couldn't speak that good, and I would say, "Me cowboy." I wanted a pair of those boots to be a cowboy. So my mom, after I turned 5, she bought me a pair of red boots with doves on them. My grandpa had eagles on his. I loved those boots. I thought those doves were eagles. I wore them out. And that's when I knew I wanted to be a cowboy.
Just a few years later, Larry began helping his father out at the cattle ranch where he worked.
And what that guy had was a bunch of bucking horses. He had some of the best stock in the state of Texas. And I worked for him for about 15 years. And I learned about rodeos. I went to a rodeo every Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Every Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, I went to white rodeos. And on Sundays, we had black rodeos. Because back in the 50s and 60s, it was separate. Black guys couldn't ride with white guys.
Throughout his childhood, Larry endured a fair amount of teasing due to his love of cowboy attire, though not from all of his classmates.
Junior high, high school, everything, man. Elementary, they had never heard of a black cowboy, majority of the people. Some people would walk behind me and trip me if I had on cowboy boots and knock me to the ground and said, blacks don't wear cowboy boots. And that's black people doing that to me. And I didn't have a whole lot of problems with whites treating me, because I worked for the biggest stock producer in Texas. And people tried to be nice to me so they could come out to the ranch and ride. The white guys. But so the blacks didn't know or didn't care about being cowboys back then. So they gave me trouble in school, plucked me in the back of the head when I was on the bus, everything, for wearing cowboy boots, but I kept wearing them.
As an adult, Larry went to college for a couple of years, and then he settled into a job with the U.S. Postal Service, where he worked for 34 years. When he wasn't working, he was pursuing his music, even playing for the likes of President George Bush and Texas Governor Ann Richards. But he never lost his passion for rodeos, or for the cowboy ways he'd grown up around. So after retiring from the post office, he got a fun gig as a sort of cowboy in residence at the nearby George Ranch Historical Park. And that changed everything.
That's when I started learning about cowboys and where cowboys came from. On rainy days, I stayed inside and I would read old books. And I found out that, I had heard from my uncle. I had an uncle with me. He was 94 years old. And he would tell me, he said, boy, back in the 1920s and 30s, they didn't call white cowboys cowboys. He said they would call them cowhands. And they would call the black men cowboys. And I said, that can't be true. I said, when did they start calling white cowboys cowboys? And he didn't know. But I found out at the George Ranch that the black cowboys were called cowboys because they had people that worked in the house. He was called a houseboy. They had people who worked in the yard. They were called yard boys. And the people that worked the cows were called cowboys. But the white man refused to be called a cowboy because the word boy meant a servant or a slave. So they didn't want to be associated with being called cowboys. They were called cowhands or cowman or cow puncher. But they refused to be called cowboys.
As he dove deeper into black cowboy history, Larry realized that pop culture, and Hollywood in particular, had whitewashed cowboy lore.
So I was reading all this stuff, and I said, man, I didn't know the black cowboys were the real cowboys until they started being on TV. Hollywood got it all wrong. They started calling white cowboys that's, on TV, cowboys. They didn't know what the word meant. Because by the 1930s and 40s, they didn't know that the word meant a slave or a servant. So they would call themselves cowboys. And then the people in Texas started hearing about it, started seeing it on TV, and they changed to call themselves cowboys. And they wouldn't put black cowboys on TV because people wouldn't accept it. If they put a black on TV, people would complain about it and turn it off.
Perhaps the biggest example of black cowboys being written out of pop culture took place in the creation of the popular radio and TV productions of The Lone Ranger. As Larry points out,
The real Lone Ranger was black. His name was Bass Reeves. He was born in 1838. He was born a slave. And when he turned 15, he hit his master, knocked him out. And he rode to Oklahoma. And he got in with the Indians. They took him in. And as long as he was with the Indians, they taught him how to fight. They taught him how to shoot. They taught him how to track. And for 20 years, he lived with the Indians until 1865. In 1865, he wanted to be a U.S. Marshal. He went to his name was Judge Parker in Oklahoma. He said, I want to be a U.S. Marshal. He said, you got to know how to write and read to be a U.S. Marshal. He said, I can't do either one, but I have a good memory. He said, okay, go get these 5 people. He named them all. He said, you have 2 months to get them, and you can bring them back dead or alive. He brought all 5 back in 3 weeks, and they made him a U.S. Marshal.
The incredible Bass Reeves story resonated to the point where he became a folk hero. But not long after the Lone Ranger show debuted on the radio, Larry says the whitewashing of Bass Reeves' legacy began.
People started singing about him, started writing stories about him. One man in 1933 got on the radio and said, I'm going to tell you the story of the Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger rides again. And he'd do this with his fingers, sound like a horse running on the radio. And people thought it was a horse on the radio, and they would sit and listen to that every Saturday night. And somebody finally called in and asked who was the Lone Ranger. And the guy said, oh, he was a black man. Oh, he had 1,000 phone calls saying they wasn't going to listen to that radio station anymore. He said, why? He said, because you said the Lone Ranger was a black man. Then he got to thinking, no, I didn't say he was a black man. I said he wore a black mask. So when they put him on TV in the 1950s, he had to be a white man with a black mask. And he also wore black gloves. They wouldn't accept him on TV as a black man. And that's why they didn't put black cowboys on TV. But they were the first cowboys. Isn't that crazy?
I wanted to get back to your family for a second. I know in addition to your father, you had an uncle and cousin who were both heavily involved in rodeo. What kind of success were they seeing in the rodeo world in Texas?
I grew up watching them. My dad saw some success, but he had to go to New York. He went to New York in 1958, and he competed in the World Championship Rodeo in New York, Madison Square Garden. He won a second in the title calf. He had won a few things in the black rodeo, but in 1950s, they wouldn't let blacks ride, or if they did, they cheated them out of every bit of money they had. I had a cousin named Calvin Greeley. He was probably the best calf roper in the world, but he couldn't prove it because they wouldn't let him win. They'd cheat him all the time, and they cheated every black person that I knew. They wouldn't let the blacks ride with the whites until 1967. My cousin, Tex Williams, he was the first black to get in an all-white rodeo in the state of Texas. He was in high school, and he won the state championship in 1967, and he won it in 68. Guess who the second black was?
Am I talking to him?
Yes. In 1971, I was the second black to make the state finals. I didn't win it, but I have it on record.
And, just as Larry got close to the big prize in that high-profile rodeo, so too went his singing career, which brought him close to a major recording deal after years of honing his craft, mostly by emulating the black country singer he'd grown up idolizing.
They received me like I was Charlie Pride. I had perfected my craft. on singing like Charlie Pride because I'd been listening to him from 1968. I used to work at Science and Rodeo. No, I was 14, 15 years old, but I started working there when I was 8. I worked the back gate. I used to listen to country music, and that's all they played on that jukebox. Every Saturday night, I'd be listening. I started popping my finger to some of the good songs and listening to Merle Haggard, George Jones, and I started singing those songs. You know, if you hear them every day, 3 or 4 times a day, you start liking them. So I was the only black that I knew outside of Charlie Pride. I didn't know Charlie Pride was black when I was listening to him. And they say, Larry, that's Charlie Pride. All my white friends say, that's Charlie. You like Charlie Pride? I said, yeah, I like him. But I didn't know he was black because they never showed his picture on the records. It was it was a blank, just saying big words, Charlie Pride. Because they didn't want Eddie. A lot of white people didn't know he was black. So when I got to see him in 1968, I was shocked. I said, that's Charlie Pride? And that's when I started singing country music.
Though Larry stood out as a black country singer, he says he didn't encounter very much resistance among music fans.
Most of the places, when they heard me sing, they loved it because I sound like Charlie Pride. I sound like Merle Haggard. I sound like George Jones. And then when George Strait came up, I started singing his stuff, and they couldn't tell if it was George Strait or Larry Callies.
And eventually you got the attention of George Strait's manager.
Yeah, I got in a contest in 1984. Out of 500 people in Texas, I was in the top 3. But I didn't win. But it was a guy named Roger Ramsey with MCA Records said, I can get you in touch with George Strait's manager. He would love to have you come down and record. Well, by the time I went to record, I was losing my voice.
So you were literally in the studio recording, or about to?
Yeah, I was recording. I couldn't hold something. I had told her 2 or 3 weeks before I went. I said, Herb, I think I'm losing my voice. He said, you just nervous because I'm George Strait's manager. I said, no, I don't think that's it. I think I'm losing my voice. And he said, well, I'm going to fly you down here. And they flew me down there. And sure enough, they found out.
So I want to get into your collection of memorabilia and talk about the Black Cowboy Museum. At what point did you come up with the idea to create the museum?
Well, do you want to know the truth?
I do.
The truth is, I'm a Christian first, and I'm a cowboy second. God asked me to open this museum. And when he said open up a museum, I laughed. I can't even talk to people. How am I going to open up a museum? I don't know anything about it. And he convinced me that I knew more than I thought I knew. And he was right. He said, step out in faith. I literally stepped out in faith. I put one foot out, and something said, you got to go all the way in. Put both feet out. And I said, okay, now, God, what you want me to do? I didn't hear from God anymore. 2 days later, I'm working in my saddle shop. I had a saddle shop, too, just a little small place. I had a bunch of old pictures and old saddles. I was collecting them. I didn't know why I was collecting them. I just liked old stuff. So I would collect these old saddles. People started bringing me old saddles. 2 days after I heard God say, you need to open up a Black Cowboy Museum. SWAT guy, a white guy, walked in my saddle shop. He said, what you got here? I said, I got a saddle shop. He said, no, with all this old stuff. You know, I had an old phone, old saddles, and old boots and stuff. And he said, you ever thought about opening up a museum? I went, what? I said, I don't know how to open up a museum. He said, well, I do. He said, I worked for the city of Rosenberg. I can set you up in a nice place, and, you know, you bring all your stuff here, and it'll be a museum. He said, I'll teach you how to do it. Well, 2 weeks later, I didn't have a saddle shop anymore. I had a museum.
Not long after that, a reporter wrote an article for the local newspaper about Larry's new endeavor, and that, in turn, helped Larry grow his collection.
When they put that in the paper, people started bringing me stuff. Old stuff they had in their closet. Old stuff they had in their attic. I have an old stove from the 1800s, you know, like he used to cook on. It was a guy that just came in and said, hey, you want this? I have an old chest from the 1800s that went on the back of a stagecoach. It's from 1850. You can hear it. Listen to this. I just opened it up. It's an old chest.
Along the way, Larry kept crossing paths with a fellow enthusiast at various cowboy-themed events, and that connection led to more items finding their way to Larry's collection.
This guy, he had a bunch of guns and a bunch of badges and stuff. And we got to, every time I would go somewhere, he would come there. And I said, man, that's a pretty good collection you got. And he said, you got a good collection. So we got together, and he donated a sheriff's badge, a marshal badge, and a Texas Ranger badge from the 1800s. And he had one in his hand. He's a white guy. And he said, you probably don't want this one. And I said, what does this say? And I looked at the badge, and it says, Plantation Police, Runaway Slave Patrol, South Carolina, 1858. I said, that's the badge I want. So he donated all that stuff to me. Then he asked me if he could bring his rifles. He has about 10 rifles. He has about 20 black powder pistols, all sizes. He has another 20 or 30 badges. And we filled up this place. It's a 3-room, 1,600 square feet. And in 2 years, I filled it up.
Perhaps the centerpiece of Larry's museum is his collection of historical photographs and art, the first photos coming to him back when he was working at the George Ranch.
I have pictures of cowboys from 1861, black cowboys. I have a picture on the left side of me. It's from 1880. It has 7 black cowboys and 1 white cowboy. And it's from the George Ranch.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, when you were working there, didn't you discover some photos?
That's the photo I'm talking about. And they were really throwing them out. And I saw this photo in the trash. I said, hey, man, y'all gonna throw this away? They said, yeah. They said, you want it? I said, I can have it. They gave it to me. I blew it up till about 4 foot by 6 foot. And I blew that picture up, and I had another picture that was drawn by Frederick Remington in 1861 of a black cowboy that's riding in a stampede in the rain. And it's lightning. It's called Stampeded by Lightning. It's a cool-looking picture, man, by Frederick Remington. It's one of the best things I ever put in one of my windows.
The unique nature of Larry's museum has led to a great deal of media coverage, most notably articles in the New York Times, as well as a moving mini-documentary film on Larry produced by the newspaper. All of the media attention has led to the museum attracting visitors from around the globe.
People have heard about this museum all the way to France, England, South Africa. I had people coming from South Africa to my museum. People coming from Italy, Venezuela. I've had all those kind of people coming. You get a chance to see it. It's something to see and something to hear. I mean, you could see everything in an hour and a half, but to get all these stories, it'll take 3 hours.
So how have you gone about gathering the items? Are they all donations, or do you seek things out and purchase things?
90% is all donations. I got a cowbell yesterday, and I looked up this cowbell, and it's from the 1800s. I knew it was old. I looked at it and went, whoa, he's going to give me this? It was 2 old black people. They used to live on a ranch, and he gave me a saw from the 1800s. I'm looking at it right now. It's laying on the floor. I hadn't put it up on the wall yet. But that cowbell, I had to look that up. I'm going to look up that old saw and see how old it is. It's not made like any saw you've ever seen. It's old. So people are still bringing me stuff.
Yeah. So are there any artifacts or items still out there that you know of and are looking to collect and display at the museum?
Well, if they come to me, they come to me.
2 notable items he did acquire himself, years before he had the museum, are an old saddle from a well-known group of black soldiers and a horse bit that goes back much further.
I don't go to garage sales, but something caught my eye. I saw an old saddle from the 1850s. It was Buffalo Soldiers. Remember the Buffalo Soldiers? The saddles they rode on. Well, there was one at this garage sale, and this guy came over. He said, "Hey, man, what are you looking for?" I said, I just stopped to look at this saddle. He said, "It's $150. I said, "I can buy that." And he sold it to me. And I saw this other thing that was sitting on the table. I said, "What the heck is this?" He said, "That's an old bit. I think it's from Spain." I said, "How much do you want for that?" He said, "You want this?" He said, "Nobody's even picked it up except for you." I said, "Yeah." I said, "I only got $25 more." And he said, "Give me $25. I just want to get rid of all this stuff." So I gave him $25. And you know what the guy from Oklahoma Hall of Fame came in and said? He said, "Larry, where did you get this bit from? That's priceless. That's a bit. It's either from Spain or from Africa." I went, "What?" He said, "That's in the 1200s to the 1400s. He didn't know which one. He said, "I've never seen one of these, but I've seen them in the pictures." Isn't that crazy?
One man's trash is another man's treasure, I guess.
Really? I hit the jackpot on that one.
Uh-huh. So I want to switch gears again and ask you kind of a bigger picture question. It seems like in recent years, the idea of the Black Cowboy has become more accepted, and we even see it in pop culture with Lil Nas X. Do you feel like people are starting to come around?
You know where he got that idea from?
Where?
I did a video 10 years ago, and a girl came out to the George Ranch and did a video on me. And they said that video got all over the United States, and people were watching it. And they had never heard of Black Cowboys before. And I was telling the story that I'm telling to you. And that's what made them start wanting to be cowboys. And Beyonce, I'm in a thing from New York in an article. It's got me in the middle and Beyonce on one side and Little Nas X on the other side. The New York Times. You can find it. It's an article that was written, and they had my picture in there. The Black Cowboy Museum has gotten her all over, and because of the article in the New York Times, and that's what people read it. And like Beyonce and Little Nas X, they started dressing that way.
Uh-huh. And speaking of celebrities, is it true that Whoopi Goldberg made a contribution to the museum?
Yeah, She donated some money to the museum. She read that same article in the New York Times.
At one point, Larry's Black Cowboy Museum attracted another armchair historian, a man who had an interest in genealogy and who made an interesting discovery about Larry's family history.
He looks up people's pedigree, and he looked up mine, and he goes all the way back to 14th generation. The 14th generation, I'm kin to King Edward IV and Queen Elizabeth.
Oh, my goodness.
You don't have to bow to me right now.
And, as an amateur historian in his own right, Larry continues to make new discoveries about the complex, multicultural history of Texas. And as a showman, he's great at teasing it.
I just discovered some more history in Texas that's going to blow people away. I can't tell you on the phone. I can't tell you right now because I'm writing another book. I just discovered something about Texas that's just going to floor people. I thought all I was going to deal with was cowboys. God hasn't got me dealing with history. It goes back to 1812 and 1821. It's about slaves. It's about the Alamo. It's about Santa Ana. It's about Sam Houston. It's a story. But you're going to have to read my book. I'm not going to give this out. Somebody else will write it first.
Fair enough. Hold on to it.
Yep.
Well, Larry, that's everything I've got for you. I want to thank you for helping us understand your fascinating life story and your desire to shed some light on the bigger story of Black cowboy history and culture. This has been fun.
Yeah, I appreciate you. What are you doing? You going to put it on a radio or you got
a podcast, so it'll be on the internet, audio program on the internet.
Oh, Lord. I don't really like my voice, but I can't say that because if God wanted me to talk the way I used to talk and sing, he could do it in 1 second, give me my voice back. But for some reason, he wants me to talk like this. So.
Well, the story comes through regardless.
All right.
Thanks again.
You're welcome. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Take care. All right. Bye-bye.
Well, on paper, Larry Callies may not have seemed like the most likely person to open up a history museum, but with a life story that's offered up more twists and turns than a bucking horse at the rodeo, why not? Larry's managed to hold on, find purpose, and make his voice one of the strongest in the effort to spread the word on the compelling history of Black cowboys. For Keeps is a production of me, David Peterkovsky. My thanks to Larry Callies for sharing his story, as well as the story of the Black Cowboy Museum of Rosenberg, Texas, and the historical memorabilia he's collected. At forkeepspodcast.com, you'll find photos of Larry and some of the items from his archive. The show's theme song is by Still Flyin, and the closing theme is by Eric Frisch. Additional music for this episode was provided by Audionautics and Jesse Cunningham. You can visit the show online at forkeepspodcast.com or follow For Keeps on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at For Keeps Podcast. And if you like the show, you can hit the subscribe button. You can be a good partner by hitting the share button in your podcast player. Or you can give the show a tip of your 10-gallon hat by posting a positive review of it wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening to For Keeps. Until next time, keep on keeping on.